No human would go near her, but he took her hand and said, "Let's do this together." The Untouchable, a coffee shop on Fifth Avenue, buzzed with morning energy, but a strange, quiet bubble surrounded Table 7. Customers unconsciously steered clear, servers hurried past with their eyes down, and even the boldest regulars found excuses to sit elsewhere. At the center of this invisible barrier sat Natasha Volkov, methodically stirring her black coffee. While reviewing laboratory reports on her tablet dot, she didn't blame them for their fear. The scar tissue covering the left side of her face told a story most people couldn't bear to hear. 3 years ago, a chemical explosion at Meridian Research. Labs had changed everything. The experimental compound she'd been developing a breakthrough treatment for neurological disorders had backfired spectacularly, leaving her face partially disfigured and her reputation in ruins. The lawsuit from the company had been brutal. They'd painted her as reckless, dangerous, a scientist who prioritized ambition over safety protocols. The settlement had drained her savings, but worse than the financial ruin was the professional exile. No reputable lab would hire her. Her former colleagues crossed the street to avoid conversations. Even her family had grown distant, their discomfort palpable during stilted holiday gatherings. Now she worked alone, conducting freelance research from a converted garage, taking on projects no one else wanted. Her latest client was a small pharmaceutical startup desperate enough to overlook her reputation. The work was beneath her qualifications, but it paid the bills and kept her hands busy. Loneliness, however, was a constant companion. The bell above. The coffee shop door chimed, and Natasha glanced up from habit. A man in his early 30s entered, shaking raindrops from his jacket. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who spent more time thinking than primping. She recognized him, Dr. James Mitchell, a veterinarian from the animal clinic 3 blocks over. He'd been coming here for weeks, always ordering the same thing. Medium coffee, 2 sugars, no cream. What she didn't expect was for him to notice her noticing him. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and instead of the usual quick look away, she'd grown. Accustomed to, he smiled. Not the pitying smile she despised, but something warmer, more genuine. James had indeed noticed her before. How could he not? She sat in the same spot every Tuesday and Thursday, radiating an intensity that intrigued him. He'd seen the scar, of course, but what struck him more was the intelligence in her eyes and the way she held herself proud despite whatever pain she carried. Working with animals had taught him that the most wounded creatures often possessed the greatest capacity for healing, both for themselves and others. His rescue dogs had shown him that scars didn't define worth. Every Tuesday he'd wanted to approach her, but something in her posture warned against intrusion. Today felt different. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at him, or perhaps it was the research article he'd read about her work buried in the archives of a medical journal, written before her accident. Her groundbreaking research on neural regeneration had nearly revolutionized treatment for spinal cord injuries. A mind like that shouldn't be sitting alone in a coffee shop, avoided like a plague carrier. He ordered his usual coffee and surprised himself by walking toward Table 7. The conversations around them seemed to dim, and he felt the weight of curious stares. Natasha tensed as he approached, her hand instinctively moving to shield the scarred side of her face. "Dr. Volkov?" he said softly, stopping a respectful distance away. "I'm James Mitchell. I've been wanting to introduce myself for weeks, but I didn't want to intrude." She studied him warily. "Most people prefer to keep their distance, Dr. Mitchell. I can't imagine what you'd want to discuss with me." "Actually," he said, pulling out the chair across from her, "I was hoping you might help me with a problem. I have a patient, a German shepherd named Rex, who suffered spinal trauma in an accident. Traditional treatments aren't working, and I've read about your research on neural regeneration. I was wondering if you might consult on his case." For the first time in months, genuine surprise flickered across Natasha's features. "You want my help?" "I want your expertise," James corrected, settling into the chair despite the obvious tension his presence created in the room. "Rex's family is devastated. They're considering euthanasia, but I believe there might be another way. Your research suggested possibilities that conventional veterinary medicine hasn't explored." Natasha felt something shift inside her chest, a flutter of hope she'd thought long dead. Someone wanted her mind, not her pity story. Someone saw past the scars to the scientist beneath. "I'd need to see his case files," she said carefully. "And I should warn you, my current circumstances aren't exactly conducive to collaborative research." James smiled, and she noticed how it transformed his entire face. "I have a fully equipped clinic and flexible hours. What I don't have is your brilliance." Unexpected partnership. The animal clinic after hours felt like a sanctuary. Soft lighting cast warm shadows across the examination rooms, and the familiar sense of antiseptic and animal bedding created an oddly comforting atmosphere. Natasha stood beside the treatment table where Rex lay sedated, his powerful body eerily still except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. "The initial trauma crushed 2 vertebrae," James explained, pointing to the X-rays illuminated on the wall viewer. "We stabilized the spine, but there's been no improvement in sensation or movement below the injury site." His owners, the Kowalski family, their teachers with 2 young children. Rex isn't just their pet, he's family. Natasha studied the images with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years understanding the intricate dance of neural pathways. The traditional approach would be anti-inflammatory treatments and physical therapy, hoping for minimal recovery. "Which is exactly what we've been doing for 8 weeks, James said, frustration evident in his voice. "But your research suggested that certain compounds could stimulate neural regeneration at the cellular level. I've been reading everything you published before." He stopped himself, realizing his mistake. "Before I became unemployable?" Natasha finished, her tone matter-of-fact rather than bitter. "It's all right, Dr. Mitchell. I know what people say about me." "James," he corrected. "And what I was going to say is before you were forced to work alone. The scientific community's loss is becoming increasingly clear to me." She turned from the X-rays to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. In the soft lighting, the scarred side of her face felt less prominent, and for a moment she forgot to hide behind her hair. "The compound I was developing," she said slowly, "it was designed to create microscopic channels that would allow damaged neurons to reconnect across injury sites. The explosion happened during the final testing phase." "What went wrong?" Natasha was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the examination table. "I thought I was being careful. I thought I'd accounted for every variable. But the reaction was more volatile than my models predicted. The lab explosion wasn't just an accident, it was my miscalculation that nearly killed 3 people. But the underlying science was sound, the theory was solid. The application ... she shrugged. That's where everything fell apart." James moved closer, his voice gentle but determined. "What if we approached it differently? Smaller doses, controlled. ENVIRONMENT, constant monitoring. Rex is going to be euthanized anyway if we don't try something revolutionary." Natasha felt her heart racing. The idea of returning to her research, of potentially helping someone, even if that someone was a dog, ignited something she thought was permanently extinguished. But the fear was equally strong. If something goes wrong again, then we'll deal with it together, James said simply. "I've been a veterinarian for 8 years. I've seen miracles and heartbreak in equal measure. but I've never seen anything like your research. Rex deserves a chance, and honestly, so do you." The word "together" echoed in her mind. When was the last time someone had offered to share both the risk and the potential reward of her work? Over the next 3 hours, they pored over her research notes, which she'd brought on her laptop. James asked intelligent questions, offered insights from his veterinary experience, and never once made her feel like a pariah seeking redemption. Instead, he treated her like what she was, a brilliant scientist whose expertise could save lives. "We'd need to synthesize a modified version of the compound," Natasha explained, sketching molecular structures on the whiteboard in James's office. "Lower concentration, different delivery method. Instead of direct injection, we could use a gradual release system. The clinic has a small lab setup," James offered. "It's not research grade, but we could potentially create small batches for testing." "This is insane," Natasha said, but there was excitement in her voice for the first time in years. Professional collaboration with a disgraced scientist on an experimental treatment that could either save or kill your patient. James grinned. "I've never been accused of taking the easy path." As they worked, the invisible wall Natasha had built around herself began to crack. James's enthusiasm was infectious, his respect for her intellect genuine. He didn't stare at her scars or speak in the careful, pitying tones she'd grown to hate. He argued with her theories, challenged her assumptions, and treated her like an equal. When they finally looked up from their work, dawn was breaking through the clinic windows. Rex stirred on the examination table, and James went to check on him while Natasha gathered her notes. "Thank you," she said as he returned. "For what?" "For seeing me as a scientist first." James paused in cleaning his glasses, studying her face in the morning light. "That's all I've ever seen, Dr. Volkov. Everything else is just noise." For the first time in 3 years, Natasha felt like she might be more than her mistakes. And as she watched James tend to his patient with gentle expertise, she realized she was looking forward to tomorrow's research session more than she'd looked forward to anything in a very long time. Breaking through the makeshift laboratory James had created in the clinic's storage room buzzed with quiet activity. Over the past 2 weeks, he and Natasha had transformed the space into something resembling a proper research facility. Equipment borrowed from veterinary suppliers, microscopes requisitioned from the local college, and chemistry supplies ordered through carefully worded requests had turned the cramped room into their private sanctuary of scientific possibility. Natasha bent over a compound microscope, adjusting the focus as she examined neural tissue samples. The modified treatment they'd developed showed promising results in their preliminary tests, but she remained cautious. The memory of her last failure was never far from her thoughts. "The cellular response is better than I expected," she murmured, making notes on her tablet. "The neural pathways are showing signs of attempted regeneration." James looked up from where he was preparing Rex for his 3rd treatment session. The German shepherd had become surprisingly cooperative, as if sensing that these humans were trying to help rather than simply poke and prod him. "His reflexes have improved marginally," James reported. "Yesterday, I thought I saw a response in his hind leg when I stimulated the paw pad. Could have been wishful thinking, but ... "But you don't think it was," Natasha finished, understanding the hope in his voice. The Kowalski family had been cautiously optimistic when James explained the experimental treatment. 8-year-old Emma had drawn pictures of Rex running again, while her younger brother Tommy had solemnly promised the dog his favorite squeaky toy if he got better. The weight of their faith pressed on both researchers, but it also fueled their determination. "There's something I need to tell you," Natasha said, setting down her microscope. "I've been in contact with my former research partner at Meridian Labs, quietly through back channels. James paused in his examination of Rex. What kind of contact? Dr. Patricia Hendricks. She was supposed to be in the lab the day of the explosion, but she called in sick. She's been following our work, apparently. Someone at the veterinary supply company mentioned our unusual orders. The implications made James's stomach tighten. Is that a problem? It could be. Patricia says there are people at Meridian who would be very interested in what we're doing. The company never officially abandoned the neural regeneration research after the accident. They just moved it underground. Natasha moved to the small window, gazing out at the busy street. If we succeed with Rex, if we can prove the treatment works safely, Meridian will claim ownership of the underlying patents. They'll say I was still their employee when I developed the original compound. But you've modified it significantly. This is new research, built on their foundation, she said quietly. James, if this works, I might lose the right to continue the research. Worse, they might try to shut us down entirely to protect their own interests. James set down his clipboard and moved to stand beside her at the window. What do you want to do? The question was simple, but it cut to the heart of everything. Natasha had spent 3 years in exile, branded a failure, professionally destroyed. The smart thing would be to walk away, protect herself from further damage. But looking at Rex, thinking about Emma's drawings and Tommy's hopeful face, she realized she couldn't abandon this chance at redemption. I want to help Rex, she said firmly, whatever the consequences. James felt something shift between them in that moment. Her vulnerability, her courage in the face of potential ruin, revealed a strength that had nothing to do with professional credentials or unblemished reputations. Then we help Rex, he said simply. Together. That afternoon, they administered the treatment while monitoring Rex's vital signs with equipment that would have impressed most research hospitals. The compound, a modified version of Natasha's original formula, was introduced gradually through a specialized 4-system James had designed. Neural activity is stable, Natasha reported, watching the readouts. No adverse reactions so far. Heart rate normal, respiration steady, James added. How long before we see results? If it works at all, we should see initial neural response within 6 to 8 hours. Full motor function recovery, if it happens, could take days or weeks. They settled in for a long night of monitoring. As the hours passed, they talked in the way that only people sharing a profound risk can talk honestly, without pretense, revealing pieces of themselves usually kept hidden. I used to dream about winning the Nobel Prize, Natasha admitted around midnight, her voice soft in the darkened clinic. Ridiculous, probably, but I believed my research could change everything. It still could, James said. This isn't over. Even if Rex recovers completely, even if we prove the treatment works, the scientific community will never accept me back. I'm poison now. James was quiet for a moment, then said, You know what I've learned from working with rescue animals? The ones who've been hurt the most, who've been abandoned and written off, they often become the most loyal, the most grateful for a second chance. The scientific community might be too proud to admit they were wrong about you, but there are other ways to make a difference. At 3:17 a.m., Rex's left hind leg twitched. Not the involuntary spasm they'd seen before, but a deliberate movement in response to stimulus. Did you see that? James whispered, hardly daring to hope. Natasha's hands shook as she checked the neural monitors. Brain activity is spiking. The pathways are responding. Over the next hour, they watched in amazement as Rex began to show signs of sensation returning to his paralyzed limbs. By dawn, he was attempting to lift his head, his eyes more alert than they'd been since the accident. We did it, James breathed. Hardly believing what he was seeing, Natasha stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, the first tears she'd shed since the explosion. He's going to walk again? James moved to her side, and without thinking, she turned into his embrace. For a moment, the scarred, guarded woman who'd been hiding from the world disappeared, replaced by the brilliant, passionate scientist she'd always been underneath the pain. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else would." "Thank you for trusting me with your brilliance," he replied, his arms tightening around her god outside. The city was waking up, but inside the clinic, a small miracle was unfolding. Rex was moving his tail, and two people who'd found each other, in the midst of their separate struggles, were discovering that sometimes the most beautiful breakthroughs happened when you stopped working alone. The test of trust, the video call with the Kowalski family, was supposed to be a routine update. But when 8-year-old Emma saw Rex standing on all 4 legs, her scream of joy nearly shattered the laptop speakers. Through the screen, James and Natasha watched as the entire family crowded around the computer, tears streaming down their faces. "He's really okay?" Mrs. Kowalski asked, her voice thick with emotion. "He's going to come home? He needs another week of observation and physical therapy." James explained, "But yes, Rex is going to make a full recovery." 2 weeks had passed since the breakthrough. Rex's progress had been remarkable, from tentative steps to confident walking, from listless patient to eager, tail-wagging dog. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. But with the good news came complications neither researcher had anticipated. Word had spread quickly through the veterinary community. What had started as a private experiment between 2 colleagues had become the subject of whispered conversations in clinics across the city. James had fielded a dozen calls from other veterinarians asking about the miracle treatment, and Natasha had discovered strangers trying to access her old research files through university databases. "We have a problem," Patricia Hendricks announced during her unscheduled visit to the clinic. Natasha's former colleague arrived with a briefcase full of legal documents and an expression that mixed admiration with professional concern. They met in James's office after hours, Rex sleeping peacefully in his kennel nearby, a living testament to their success and the source of their current troubles. Meridian Labs has been monitoring unusual chemical purchases in the area, Patricia explained, spreading papers across the desk. When your names appeared on supply orders, it raised flags. They know what you're doing. Natasha had been expecting this moment, but the reality was still chilling. What do they want? Complete research data, proprietary rights to the modified compound, and your immediate cease and desist of all related activities. Patricia read from the legal documents. They're claiming you violated your employment contract by continuing research based on their intellectual property. James felt his jaw clench. She wasn't their employee when she developed the new treatment. This is original research, built on foundational work they funded, Patricia countered. Their lawyers are very good at these arguments. Natasha stood and moved to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the evening glass. If I fight them, it could take years and cost more money than I'll ever have. If I comply, the research dies here. There's a third option, Patricia said quietly. They've made an offer. The silence in the room was deafening. James watched Natasha's shoulders tense, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. They want you back, Patricia continued. Full reinstatement, research budget, your own lab. In exchange, you assign all rights to the neural regeneration work to the company. And if I refuse, they'll bury you in litigation. They'll claim you stole proprietary information, violated trade secrets, maybe even charge you with corporate espionage. James felt something cold settle in his stomach. What about the treatment? What about other animals who could be helped? Patricia's expression softened slightly. Meridian isn't interested in veterinary applications. They want to adapt the treatment for human use. The profit potential is enormous. Human trials, Natasha whispered, still staring out the window. That's what I was originally working toward. Think about it, Natasha, Patricia urged. You could finally complete your research. Human spinal cord injuries, neurological disorders, you could save thousands of lives. Isn't that what you always wanted? The offer was everything Natasha had lost 3 years ago. Professional redemption, unlimited resources, the chance to fulfill her original vision. But accepting it would mean abandoning James, walking away from the partnership that had brought her back to life. I need time to think, she said finally. After Patricia left, James and Natasha sat in silence, both acutely aware that their fragile world was about to shatter. You have to take it, James said eventually, his voice carefully neutral. Do I? It's everything you've worked for. A chance to help people on a scale we could never achieve here. Natasha turned from the window to face him. What if I don't want to go back to working alone? The question hung between them, laden with implications. Neither had dared voice before. Over the past month, they'd become more than research partners. Late nights in the lab had given way to shared dinners. Professional discussions had evolved into personal conversations, and the careful distance they'd maintained was gradually disappearing. You wouldn't be alone, James said. You'd have a whole team, unlimited resources. But not you. The simple statement cracked something open in James's chest. He stood and moved to her, close enough to see the uncertainty in her eyes. I'm a small-town veterinarian, Natasha. You're a world-class researcher who belongs in laboratories that can change the world. What if I'd rather change one life at a time right here? James reached up to touch her face, his fingers tracing the scarred skin she'd hidden for so long. I would never ask you to give up your dreams for me. What if my dreams have changed? She whispered. What if what I want now is a partner who sees my mind before my mistakes, who fights beside me instead of for me? The kiss was inevitable, months of growing attraction and deepening respect, culminating in a moment of perfect honesty. When they finally separated, both knew that whatever decision she made would determine not just her career, but the future of what they built together. I love you, James said simply, which is why I'll support whatever choice you make. Even if it means losing me? Even then. Natasha felt her heart breaking and soaring simultaneously. Tomorrow she would give Patricia her answer, but tonight she held the man who'd restored her faith in herself and wondered if the greatest breakthrough of her career might be learning that some partnerships are worth more than any laboratory. In the world, Rex stirred in his kennel, stood up, and walked over to them, a living reminder that miracles could happen when two people decided to face the impossible together. The choice that changes everything. The morning light filtered through the clinic windows as Natasha sat beside Rex's kennel, watching the German shepherd play with a rubber ball. 3 months ago, he'd been paralyzed and scheduled for euthanasia. Now he was bounding around like a puppy, his recovery complete and his joy infectious. James found her there, 2 cups of coffee in his hands, and an expression that tried to hide his anxiety about the decision she had to make today. Patricia was expecting her answer by noon, and Meridian Labs had made it clear that any delay would be interpreted as refusal. Sleep well? He asked, settling beside her on the bench. Barely, she admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. I kept thinking about a conversation I had with my graduate advisor years ago. She told me that the most important discoveries weren't just about brilliant minds, but about brilliant minds working in environments where they could thrive. James nodded, unsure where this was leading, but sensing its importance. I spent 3 years believing I was broken, Natasha continued, that the explosion had destroyed not just my face, but my ability to be a good scientist. Working with you these past months has shown me something different. She turned to face him, and James was struck by how different she looked from the young. guarded woman he'd first approached in the coffee shop. The scars were still there, but they no longer seemed to define her. "I'm not the same person who worked at Meridian Labs," she said. "That woman was brilliant, but arrogant, innovative, but isolated. She needed to be right more than she needed to be helpful. The explosion didn't just change my appearance, it changed my priorities." "What are you saying?" Before she could answer, the clinic door chimed, and Patricia entered with a man in an expensive suit. Even without introductions, James knew this was someone from Meridian's legal department. "Dr. Volkov," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Richard Lawson, Chief Legal Counsel for Meridian Labs. I'm here to facilitate your return to the company." Natasha stood slowly, her posture straight and confident. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Lawson, but I won't be returning to Meridian." Patricia's face fell. "Natasha, please think about this. The human applications of your research will be developed by someone else," Natasha interrupted. "My research notes from the original project are still in Meridian's files. Any competent neurochemist can pick up where I left off." Lawson's expression hardened. "Then you leave us no choice but to pursue legal action for patent infringement and theft of proprietary information." "Actually," Natasha said, pulling out her own folder of documents, "I think you'll find that won't be necessary." She handed papers to both Patricia and Lawson. "What you're holding is a complete technical description of the modified compound. We used to treat Rex, along with all our research data and treatment protocols. I'm releasing it into the public domain under a Creative Commons license." James stared at her in shock. "Natasha, what are you doing?" "Something I should have done years ago," she replied. "I'm making the research freely available to anyone who wants to use it. Veterinarians, researchers, pharmaceutical companies, anyone. No patents, no proprietary claims, no corporate ownership." Lawson looked like he'd swallowed something sour. "You can't do that. The underlying patents belong to Meridian for human applications," Natasha agreed. "But our modified compound is sufficiently different that it falls outside your patent claims. I've had it reviewed by an intellectual property attorney." She smiled, and James realized this was the first time he'd seen her look truly free. "You can still pursue human clinical trials with the original formula, Mr. Lawson, but you can't stop veterinarians from helping animals with our version." Patricia shook her head in disbelief. "You're throwing away millions of dollars in potential licensing fees." "I'm ensuring that the research gets used instead of locked up in corporate vaults," Natasha corrected. "Do you know how many animals could benefit from this treatment? How many families like the Kowalskis could have their companions healed?" After the Meridian representatives left angry but legally powerless to stop her, James and Natasha stood alone in the clinic. Rex had wandered over during the confrontation and was now sitting between them, as if sensing the importance of the moment. "You gave up everything," James said quietly. "Professional rehabilitation, unlimited research funding, the chance to work on human applications." "I gave up their vision of my future," Natasha corrected. "I'm keeping my own." "Which is?" She moved closer to him, close enough that he could see the determination in her eyes, alongside something deeper: love, trust, and the quiet confidence of someone who had finally found where she belonged. "I want to stay here," she said. "I want to keep working with you, helping animals, maybe training other veterinarians in the treatment. I want to build something that matters, one patient at a time." James felt his heart hammering against his ribs. "Are you sure? This is a small clinic in a small town. You could be changing the world." "I am changing the world," she said, gesturing to Rex, who was now playfully chasing his own tail. "One dog at a time, one family at a time, one breakthrough at a time. And I'm doing it with someone who sees me as a partner, not just a brilliant mind to be managed." The kiss was deeper this time, filled with the promise of a future built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and love that had grown from professional admiration into something unshakable. When they finally separated, James rested his forehead against hers. "So what happens now?" "Now we expand the clinic," Natasha said with a grin. "I've been thinking about that storage room upstairs. With some modifications, it could become a proper research lab. We could offer the treatment to veterinarians nationwide, maybe even internationally. We? If you'll have me as a permanent partner, professional and personal." James answered by kissing her again, and Rex barked his approval from where he sat watching them. 6 months later, the Mitchell-Volkov Veterinary Research Center had treated over 200 animals with spinal injuries. The success rate was remarkable, and veterinarians from across the country were coming to learn the technique. Natasha had found her calling not in corporate laboratories or academic institutions, but in a place where her brilliance could serve love of animals, love of healing, and love of the man who had seen past her scars to the scientist beneath. The coffee shop on Fifth Avenue still buzzed with morning energy, but now 2 people sat at table 7, sharing breakfast and planning their next research project. No one avoided them anymore. Instead, they'd become local celebrities, the veterinarian, and the scientist who'd proved that sometimes the most important discoveries happened when you stopped working alone and started working together.